everybody, it is springtime and planting season. So today we're going to be making a very spacious planter box, raised planter box, for under $40. Let's get going. This garden box is made mainly with cedar fence pickets. And if you're wondering why we're using fence pickets, it's because of the cheap cost. Cedar can be very expensive, but fence pickets are fairly cheap. Now, I didn't have the cutting of the fence pickets recorded because I actually started this project in the winter, but I thought I'd publish this video because it's a fairly easy project to build and many people have been asking me for this project. Now, after you've sanded the boards, it's time to join the legs, and we're joining these with some glue and screws as well as some clamps. And although it'd be preferable to use pocket screws, I didn't have a jig, so this worked just fine. Now I'm using 1.5-inch screws, and cedar splits a lot, so you're going to need to use a clamp to hold that wood together sometimes. Okay, attaching those pieces together to form the leg was a bit hard because the wood split quite often. But we got it done, and you saw me patch those areas, but now we need to sand off all that excess glue to make it look all pretty. So my solution for this is to stack two 2x4s on top of each other, then put the leg on top of the 2x4s to support the leg. Then we can sand across, and we're also going to round over the edge just to make it look nice. So let's get started. Sanding this leg was fairly satisfying. Using 80 grit sandpaper, I made a quick round over without using a router. Now, a router is obviously preferable, but I didn't have one, and this worked just fine. After we had sanded all 4 legs, it was time to move on to assembling the long sides. Now, to assemble the long sides, I used 1.25-inch screws, and you'll find out later that that was a very bad idea. But I used the 1.25-inch screws along with some glue, and right there you're seeing me space out the boards with an 1/8 of an inch spacer. This is really helpful in creating a consistent gap between the boards that will allow the wood to expand and contract easily. And there I put the wood in backwards, so I had to redo it. Okay, so we're experiencing some issues with the screws popping out of the legs. And I should have been using 1-inch screws versus 1.25-inch, and that is because the fence pickets that we're using are really closer to 1/2 inch rather than 3/4 of an inch. So if you're using fence pickets like I am, you're going to want to use 1-inch screws rather than 1.25-inch. But to solve this issue, we're just going to take a file and file down each screw like this. After we had filed down the screws, I took out my 1-inch screws that I had all along and finished up the second side. So we got both sides done, and it's looking pretty good. On the back side, we were able to use the 1-inch screws, which worked amazing. You can see nothing. Compared to this side, which also looks pretty good, but you can kind of see those little screws. Now, what I ended up doing was file them down and also cut them a little bit with the hacksaw if they were too long. So now it's time to attach the other sides that will connect the 2 sets of legs. So let's get going. Next, I put together the 2 sides, and I used a clamp to help stabilize this. This worked really well, and it's just a fairly easy process to assemble these boards. You can even use this with a drill. You don't need an impact driver. Basically any drill. You could even do it with a screwdriver, although that would be very difficult. After we had assembled all the sides together and we had a standing planter box, it was time to work on cutting some supports because those long boards were definitely a bit unstable. I used a miter saw here, but you could definitely use a handsaw or a circular saw or pretty much any saw would work well here. You could use a table saw, bandsaw, jigsaw. And I've made it with a lot of those saws. I haven't used the table saw or jigsaw, but I've used all those other saws to make this planter box. I've made this planter box about 3 times, but I've made about 7 planter boxes so far. Okay, now it's time to start cutting the supports for the bottom. Now there are 2 of these, and again I use the miter saw, but you can use pretty much any saw. So we're gonna screw in the supports with some 1-inch screws, and I did quite a few screws, and that's just to keep it in, but you probably don't need to use as many. So there you just saw me cut the bottom, and there's 5 slats for the bottom, and then I just screwed them in. Nothing fancy, but I did want to make sure they stuck in there, so I used 1.5-inch screws. It is finally time to cut the trim, and a few 45-degree cuts was all that was necessary for this trim. Now, it was a bit difficult to line it up because of the fence pickets. Now, I'll explain. The fence pickets are roughly the same size, but not perfectly identical. They're not the best lumber, they're warped, all that stuff. So it wasn't really a symmetrical planter box. It was about a 1/4 inch different on each side. So there was some gaps, but those were not very noticeable, and thinking back, the trim wasn't very necessary, but it certainly adds a cool effect, especially when you're looking at it from a distance. Now, if you missed it, I just attached the trim with some brad nails and glue, and that worked just fine. You might think that that's not very stable, but it was very stable. Now, I'm going to be coating this with some spar urethane, and I've heard a lot of people say, yes, spar urethane's amazing. I thought it was fine. It's pretty good, but I'm not sure it's really worth the price. There are some waterproofer finishes that you can put on the wood that I'm using for the bottom because it's not decorative at all, and those work just fine in my opinion. The spar urethane left a kind of rough finish, but it definitely enhanced that grain, which I love. So spar urethane, maybe it's what you want to use. Maybe I applied it wrong. Leave a comment below if you know. But here I'm just going to use some waterproofing, and that's much cheaper. It is about, I think it's like 5 times cheaper. So I'll leave a link below for both of those. Now the waterproofer looks kind of milky, but don't worry, it dries all clear. Here are a few pictures of the final product. I love that warm cedar tone, and I thought the pine trim actually had some cool grains, so I loved it. I am super excited to grow the basil, and I thought this project was a really simple project to build. You know, you could build it with only a handsaw, a sander, and a drill. And I've actually done that before. I've built several of these planter boxes. Now, some of you guys who are interested in building this project may know that Brad Rodriguez from Fix This Build That did a similar video to mine. And you're wondering, well, why should I watch this video versus his video? And his video is very good. It is, I love his channel. It's awesome. But he does use some complex tools that I don't have, and some of you guys probably don't have. So I hope this simplified that project for you. Until next time, remember, complex projects can be made with simple tools.